gonna need a bigger boat.
When Jaws came out, it shook the film industry to its core. This was one of the first true blockbusters, and many would follow afterwards. Of course, there were popular movies before this, but the trend of large movies didn't really start until afterwards. Since then, the art of making blockbusters has been refined specifically to what consumers will pay for. However, this has resulted in a stagnation of sorts where similar actors have been casted and very similar movies have been made. This is bad for the film industry because not only does it give less options for consumers, but it makes smaller directors have a much more difficult time trying to stand out. These type of movies also leave the industry to standstill, not making very much progress on what type of new movies are coming out. Before we start talking about movies today, let's go back in time and look with a little more depth at the films of yesteryear. As I touched on earlier, there were popular movies before the 70s, but not in rapid succession. This is when movies really started to change as directors like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas hit the screen and started to produce popular movie after popular movie, breaking records every time. However, despite the sheer amount of movies since the 70s blockbuster boom and how successful so many of them have been, all the experts I talked to preferred movies before this era. Why? Well, a prominent theme is that not only did the movies offer something new to the table, but they also brought the industry forward and still stand on their own well for this day. Bill Zwecker, Fox anchor and previous Chicago Sun-Times writer, has a very prominent opinion on what makes his favorite movie his favorite.
Probably number one is The Wizard of Oz, just because it sort of hit every point. It was groundbreaking in its time with the cinematography. The acting is wonderful. It's a charming story. It's held up over time, and it just it touches the heart.
Peter Seaman, a scriptwriter and member of the Academy, also has strong opinions on what are the differences between the movies of today and the ones before the blockbuster boom.
But the movies that were coming out at that time were not blockbusters. They didn't even exist, and so they were personal, much more sort of personal stories, smaller character pieces.
So yes, there was still plenty of popular movies back in the day. It's just that the way they were made and put together and written was completely different. I also asked Gigi Pritzker, producer of movies such as Hell or High Water and Ender's Game, about this, and she had similar answers. The director she cites, David Lean, was prominent in the 60s and worked on very large films such as Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago. This is what about his movies really stood out to her.
As a producer, I find them really fascinating, and I'm sure they were deeply challenging. But they're also, even though they're on a big canvas, they're such personal stories. And I find that juxtaposition of really deeply personal stories on a really grand scale fascinating to try and achieve.
This was the point of these original movies, to try to illustrate a grand epic on screen that couldn't be shown anywhere else. Well, what's changed? Well, for one, the technical ability of movies has increased greatly, and movies have been using much more technical aspects to try to grab audiences with their flashy trailers and visuals.
I think today there just is so much emphasis on the quick gimmick kind of thing, and I worry that maybe some of it's because of how audiences are reacting to things.
Audience will always vote with their money, and it's very true that the attention span is much lower than it used to be as well, meaning that trailers and movies have to be more visually appealing to make them stand out to everybody. Now that we've heard what's made the films of the early days so great, let's see how the movies of today stack up in comparison, and how they're alright and how they're not. And here we are at today. Whilst this decade has been a huge decade for movies, advancing technically and in terms of box office returns, there has been some minor problems, at least in my opinion, with the movies of today. Let's take a look at the top 10 highest grossing movies of this decade and see if you can figure out what the problem is.
I'm sorry.
Good.
Alright, and we're back. Well, did you notice anything? Well, the first big kicker is that 9 out of the 10 movies were all sequels to individual movies, and 7 out of 10 of them were created by the Walt Disney Company. These make each movie, even if they're not meant to be, very inherently similar than they probably should be. Disney owns more than you would originally think, and its recent developments in how its media has been expanding might prove to be a big danger for the industry. Now you may be wondering, how is this a bad thing? Disney has a lot of properties, yes, but the movies it produces are usually very solid, and even if similar, the production value, A-list casting, and lots of other things end up being really great. So why? Despite the similarity of the movies, the first problem doesn't come from the quality of them. It comes from the fact that one company is puppeteering them all. It means that they'll choose similar directors time after time, and not many people get to share in the fact of being a blockbuster director. It even makes it especially harder for smaller directors to enter the scene with a big movie, since they don't get the type of funding and resources that the big blockbusters do. In fact, it's difficult to the point where if a small independent project wants to be made, the director usually needs to try using a crowdfunding site to get it going. To quote Joe Russo, a former indie director who's now went on to make some of the biggest grossing movies of all time with his brother, including Marvel's Infinity War, the environment has changed. It's much more difficult in this market to get smaller films made, and crowdfunding is now the best route. Not only that, but ironically, many indie directors who break through the ice and somehow make a movie that doesn't cost much to make but is successful get swept up by bigger companies to sort of mass produce their similar films, leaving them as not a potential mentor for new indie filmmakers and not giving us the opportunity to see more of their films. This problem doesn't only exist within the indie directors. Even larger directors, such as Steven Spielberg or George Lucas, are having trouble putting their own independent movies in theaters that are their own ideas that they want to do and not something that another company wants them to. In an interview with both Spielberg and Lucas, Spielberg mentioned about an implosion in the film industry, thinking that it's going to be soon depending on how static the industry has been recently. Lucas talked about the high cost of marketing movies and the urge to make them for the masses, ignoring the smaller, more critical audiences, even saying that the more independent films will probably be relegated to television only. The other problem is how it leaves the industry at a standstill. As cinema has evolved, the types of theaters and the type of moviegoers has also evolved as well. To see this change, though, we have to look away from the screen and look a little bit more at the people behind the show, the people running the companies and making the financial decisions of these movies. Studios are out to make money, so it makes sense that they would respond to audience criticism and general criticism by making lots of similar movies. However, the problem is that that's all they listen to, and it means a sorry state for many of the larger movies of today.
I think today there just is so much emphasis on the quick gimmick kind of thing, and I worry that maybe some of it's because of how audiences are reacting to things. I don't want to. It upsets me that a lot of filmmakers, I think today, almost are dumbing down.
It's like these companies have developed a formula for the perfect blockbuster, and the perfect trailer by extension, sort of dumbing down the process, but making lots of money every time.
I really think that studios have gotten very, very good at making a blockbuster. I mean, there are very few of them that fall on their face.
These metaphorical chains on most directors help limit even more the creative potential that people can have while making scripts for popular movies. Out of the movies that came out this decade, none of them was a risk, and almost all of them were also something different from past movies. They were meant to be something more.
Those movies cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and then that much again to market. So I think blockbusters now are different in that they are engineered to be franchisable, and they are world building by design, as opposed to years ago when it was just that took off and it became a blockbuster.
So not only were these blockbusters engineered for audiences, but they were also engineered to start franchises as well, so they could keep bringing in the audiences and making more and more money out of it.
It's sad to me because that means you're just in the land of remakes, sequels, prequels, spin-offs, and the stuff isn't original, and it's not particularly interesting.
All in all, this director cold shouldering and franchise mentality may be giving companies what they want, but for the evolution of movies as a whole and introducing movies to the general public, it's doing the opposite. So where do we go from here? I don't know. I thought that it would be something very negative, but the experts I talked to were very optimistic.
And as long as Netflix and all these other, Amazon, everybody's providing indie, interesting movies that you can see, at home on your phone or wherever, then that gets satisfied as well.
I actually think it'll turn out well for indies, and I think there will be a world, but right now everybody's trying to figure out what it is.
There are so many more film festivals. There's more ways to send out stories through social media. People are promoting things on Instagram and Facebook and things like that really can make a difference.
Thank you for listening and hope you have a better outlook on movies now than you did before.